Alrighty, gang, howdy. We are in the week on comparative rhetorics. This is an extension of the conversation following from our last discussion about the kind of the beginning, the globalizing of rhetoric in the 20th century, thanks to Kenneth Burke, and the changing nature of like media culture and technology and, events and so on. The story of rhetoric in the latter half of the 20th century, for sure, is one of its enlargement. It's one of its globalization. Rhetoric is going out. What I mean by that is it's going out from the mouth, it's going out from the stage, it's going out from our constricted notions of reason associated with logic and so on, and it's going out into the world. It's going into fiction and everyday life, and pop culture is coming up, and technology, and just all around us, right? And so we're, as scholars, as critical scholars, rhetorical scholars, we are seeing rhetoric sort of happening, or influence, or even like bullying and power dynamics and ideology and so on. As the latter half of the 20th century is rolling on, more and more we're talking about this kind of stuff. And so I wanted to cover this question of comparative rhetorics, and it's a kind of two-parter. So we're doing the George Kennedy reading, and then we're going to follow it up with the Keith Lloyd intro. These are both like introductions to books. The George Kennedy book is all just his work on this question of, for him, it's a natural rhetoric. He's interested in a general theory of rhetoric, but he's interested in sort of a more materialist and even like Darwinian kind of an approach. Whereas Lloyd is interested in world rhetorics, and he's more interested in culture and people and thinking about cross-culture and interculture, and thinking about rhetorics that go beyond the Western tradition, which is a much more recent kind of set of concerns. So the Kennedy reading comes from 1998, the book, Comparative Rhetoric. You can see on the front page there, Oxford University Press, so incredible press. And the Lloyd piece is, again, an intro from an edited volume. It's a collection of different pieces written by different people on this business of comparative world rhetorics, and that is 2020, Routledge 2020. Much newer, right? So what is that? 26 years, something like that, almost 30 years difference. Now, Kennedy, my favorite copy of Aristotle's On Rhetoric that I've used since grad school this is the edition and translation by our pal George Kennedy here. So Kennedy is an ancient rhetorical historian, and he's got some major works on ancient rhetorics. So he's a historian, but he's also, in this instance, more of a kind of theorist and almost like speculator on big questions having to do with rhetoric. So one of my main mentors in rhetoric is a guy named Tom Conley. I used to use his book in this class. I don't see it anywhere around here. It's called Rhetoric in the European Tradition. I used to teach this class from that book. Then I switched over to Herrick. But, and Tom Conley taught me kind of everything I know. Just a coincidence that we have the same last name, and it's the exact same spelling too, which is wild. So it's interesting that these two Conley guys are interested in rhetoric. But Tom Conley, who was on my dissertation committee and sort of taught me everything I know about the history of rhetoric, he is or was friends with George Kennedy because they're both kind of classical historians of rhetoric. And I remember one time Tom Conley was telling me a story about Tom's wife commenting on George Kennedy. She said, according to Tom, that George is a lumper and you, Tom, are a splitter. It's always stuck with me, right? And sort of like, how do you think about the kind of work you do? Well, Kennedy is a lumper and Conley's a splitter, and just like finding distinctions, showing how this is not like that, whereas the lumper is like showing how something is like something else. And I think that's borne out in this comparative rhetoric project, because what Kennedy is up to, again, 20, almost 30 years ago, is trying to come up with this kind of all-consuming understanding of rhetoric that he wants to call a general rhetoric, right? So let's just dive in real quick. This is a longer reading than we're going to kind of give it time. I wanted to give you the prologue and then just a kind of sampling of one of the chapters. But I'm just going to kind of hit the core, theme here, and then it I think becomes pretty readable once you kind of get what's going on, right? And it's all happening in the first few pages here in the prologue. So Kennedy is interested in this business of rhetorics that go beyond the Western tradition, right? So when we tell the story of rhetoric, we go back to Greece, we go to Athens, we go to the sophists and Plato and Aristotle and the story that we've been learning, right? But, since Kennedy, or maybe a little bit before, and certainly after, the field has been asking a lot of questions about, this dominant story of what rhetoric is and what it's supposed to be, and this question of good and bad and all the rest of it. And there's been a lot of movement kind of away from thinking about sort of Aristotelian rhetoric or Ciceronian rhetoric as the rhetoric, right? And so in the last couple of decades, we talk more and more about rhetorics, plural, meaning that, there's not just one way of doing it, so to speak. Now, the basis of this class is essentially that, right? There's not just one way to think about rhetoric. There's at least four that we try to talk about in terms of sturdy models that exist over and over again that we can kind of plot things against in this course, in this history. But the kind of the baseline assumption is that rhetoric is even bigger, and it can go beyond the Western tradition. We can think about rhetoric in terms of Eastern cultures. We can think about rhetoric in terms of even the non-human, and that's actually more of Kennedy's interest. Now, this connects nicely with the Barnett reading, which is coming up in another week or so. And I think he even actually invokes Kennedy directly, this business of animals and environments and nature and natural rhetorics and so on. So this is kind of where Kennedy is getting going, is this business of what might a rhetoric look like if we thought about it in terms of animals, in terms of nature itself, right? In terms of bugs and creatures and how they move and do what they do. I wonder if you've ever looked at your pet, your animal, and how it behaves with other animals and wondered to yourself, like, there's more going on here. There's more complexity. They seem to be arguing, or they seem to be trying to persuade each other, or even shame, or, I see all kinds of interesting animal videos on Instagram. I must be in, like, dog mode lately because I'm getting lots of dog videos and they're making me like smile. I haven't owned a dog in a long time. I grew up with dogs and then I just, life got crazy. But lately I've been like really about the dogs, but my wife is not into it. So I watch dog videos and there's a lot of really interesting complex behaviors that they exhibit in terms of like getting upset with their owners or trying to manipulate or shame or bully or whatever, or be a little shady or whatever. That's kind of what Kennedy's up to here. So, basically all we need to know right at this point is that Kennedy is doing a kind of Darwinian rhetoric. He's trying to think about rhetoric as kind of part of survival. He says this on the first few pages. He talks about this on the second page, top left. He says, readers may be surprised to discover that I begin with analogies to human rhetoric in animal communication. Animals, however, use vocal and bodily signs to get what they want or avoid danger. And study of animal communication tells us something about the natural basis of rhetoric, the natural basis of rhetoric. Now, this book follows an essay that Kennedy wrote a couple of years prior, maybe several years prior, in Philosophy and Rhetoric, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's a wild essay where he proposes a unit of rhetorical labor or energy. He calls it the rheme, R-H-E-M-E. You think about a meme, right? A rhetorical meme, or like, a gene or a meme or something like this. It's a unit of kind of energy expenditure. He doesn't, I don't think, talk about the rheme in this chapter. I didn't see that. But this is kind of what he's talking about, is there's a certain kind of energy expenditure that we as biological creatures and ecological creatures, as we'll talk more about with Barnett, we engage in these kinds of basic, primal, essential activities that have to do with, protection, survival, negotiation, maybe courtship and reproduction and sexuality and all this kind of stuff that we humans do. Animals are doing it too, and he's sort of noticing a lot of the similarities. So we're going beyond the human here, whereas with Lloyd, we're going to go beyond the Western more so. So Lloyd is more interested in human culture, broadly speaking, whereas Kennedy is more interested in rhetorical culture, naturally speaking. That makes sense. So he says right on the first page what he's up to here. First of all, we want to come up with a universal, to use comparative methods to identify what is universal and what is distinctive. That's the lumping is universal and splitting is distinctive, right? This is like this, but this is not like this. And a comparative rhetoric wants to think about that, wants to think about where are the similarities across cultures, but then also what's unique. I've done a fair bit of traveling across Asia, and I'm a food guy, right? So I'm always focusing on the foods and the restaurants and what's the same and what's different. And I noticed that, like, if you ever go to a Pizza Hut in China, Pizza Hut's actually pretty popular in China. It's Pizza Hut, except it's a very different experience over there. It's elevated, it's fancy, it's this whole experience, and there's a whole different kind of a menu. So pizza is kind of the way in, but it kind of all ends there. And so if you go to Pizza Hut in like Beijing, you're going to have a completely different pizza experience than you would have back at home. Maybe even better at this point, because Pizza Hut's gotten pretty sad. But anyway, so it's that kind of a thing of like, what's similar, but not maybe the exact same, right? So you can find similarities and distinctions, and that's really what he's talking about here. Second, drawing on the first, is to come up with formulate a general theory of rhetoric that will apply in all societies, including animal, right? Third is to develop a grammar or structures and terminology, vocabulary that can be used in this, and then to start applying, right? And so he's trying to sort of propose a sub discipline of rhetorical inquiry and analysis. He says on the next page, right in the middle, no previous book has attempted to study such a wide range of materials. No kidding, right? So it was wild in 98. I think it's still wild for anyone to be talking about rhetoric in nature, right? He talks about bees. He talks about bird songs. He talks about animals and their kind of warring nature. He talks about stags and their calls and so on. It's all fascinating, right? But, what is the point of doing that? Barnett might have a better answer. It has to do with listening to nature and what it wants to tell us. But do we care about what nature is saying to itself, what two dogs are arguing over? Does it really affect us, or is it just a kind of thought experiment? It's an interesting way of trying to understand the limits of what rhetoric might be, and he's pushing it really, really far. So he says in that same paragraph in the middle, I draw on a large body of research by linguists, anthropologists, social biologists, and experts in non-Western society, many of whom, or most of whom, never even use the word rhetoric, though to me that is often what they seem to be discussing. So this was a big kind of moment for me in grad school, was realizing that you can actually point to something as being rhetorical, even if it doesn't know it's rhetorical. And so that's a big thing that we do in rhetoric when we write our papers, is to sort of make the case that something is rhetorical, right? So when I was first writing about food, I had to kind of make the case that food can be thought of as rhetoric. We do the same with technology, with fashion, with pop culture, right? So this business of rhetoric, even where it's rhetorical, even if it doesn't know it is, right? So things can influence and persuade and move and push around, even if they're not aware that they're doing it, right? And so we can talk about kind of explicitly self-conscious understandings of rhetoric, like here I am giving a speech, or here I am creating an ad campaign, or something like that, versus I really just want to accomplish something, and I'm going to use whatever means I have available to me, that's Aristotle, and I'm hoping to influence this outcome. That's also rhetorical. And so I did a lot of work in grad school finding rhetoric, where people might not realize that it's happening. It's kind of fun, but it can really kind of go on and on. You can talk about the rhetoric of planets and stars and dying suns if you wanted to, I suppose. All right, so that's important, right? So he's looking for rhetoric where others might not have talked about it before, or, even animals might not be aware that they're being rhetorical, but they could be rhetorical. Now, there's a lot of summary kind of recapping of a lot of the history that we've covered in this class already. So I'm going to be skipping, but it's useful. Again, Kennedy is a really solid historian, so you can learn a lot about basic introductory rhetoric stuff because he's speaking to a broad audience here, and he's not assuming super high level of technical understanding. So there's some nice summary stuff in here. What page are we on here? Into the chapter. Sorry, some of the pages got cut off, or the prologue, I guess we are. First page, second page, third page in. He starts talking about animals and sort of the different ways that they express themselves rhetorically. He talks about this business right at the top left there, this instinct for self-preservation. So he's attaching rhetoric to this Darwinian survival of the fittest kind of idea. And he even says that rhetoric is a kind of conservative faculty. We're using rhetoric, efforts to persuade, because we want to protect, we want to conserve, we want more food, we want more energy, we want to hold on to what we have, protection, defense, all that stuff kind of comes back down to survival, right? It's, again, an interesting argument because I don't know too many people have made this argument. I think a lot of people probably don't like it because what it does is it attaches rhetoric to something that is so innately biological and kind of therefore out of our control potentially, right? And so I think a lot of rhetoric scholars might not like this. Rhetoric scholars don't tend to like Darwinism because, again, it sort of presumes that everything is just a matter of basic primal urges and survival as opposed to what Aristotle called rhetoric as artistry, inventional, and it's about our technical aptitudes and so on. But he wants to make the case. So the next column over, just below the middle, he talks about a matter of their energy level, right? So again, rhetoric is this kind of expenditure of a certain kind of energy to get people to do things or to prevent them from doing things and so on. And then in the next page over, he starts moving into the canon, the 5 parts of the art of rhetoric, and he starts attaching the canon to different animal behaviors. And again, I think once you understand what he's up to, you can start to kind of make the argument. If you understand these basic rhetorical concepts, you can kind of see them happening if you also understand animal behavior. Oh, they're singing a song. That's sort of like communal. That looks like epideictic rhetoric. Or, oh, they're fighting over something. They're deliberating. They're trying to figure out, should they go for the dead elk or should they go for the fish that's swimming so slowly in the pond over there? You know what I'm saying? So like you can think about the canon, you can think about sort of these core rhetorical concepts going back to Aristotle and Cicero and so on, and you can sort of layer them into animal behavior. You can even talk about style, ethos, logos, and pathos. So I'm not going to get into all the particulars. It's not crucial that we understand all of those little nuances. It's just, again, kind of interesting how he's taking this rhetorical tradition and he's pushing it out into the wild environs of animals, and he doesn't go too deep below animals, but I think he does talk about like bees and bugs a little bit as well too. So, just looking at some of the communication stuff he's talking about, he talks about gestures, he talks about signaling, he talks about expression, he talks about trying to force your energy out there into the world onto some other bodies. Yeah, it's sort of the same theme over. He talks about examples of rhetoric among social animals. Talks about bugling. Next page over, he talks about like overstatement and redundancy. These are like classical rhetorical terms: overstatement, redundancy, repetition, right? Barking dog won't stop barking, repetition. So again, he's just kind of layering in these old concepts into this animal behavior stuff, just to make the case. Deliberative rhetoric, judicial rhetoric, epideictic rhetoric. So the last thing I'll just kind of mention is this final thing that he talks about is this business of intentionality, which it has been a long-standing kind of not controversy, just sort of question, I guess, tension. Does it matter what one intends versus what an outcome is, right? So, Aristotle talks about artistic invention. That is something that we intend. We intend to use our reasoning this way. We intend to invoke pathos, and we're being artful in this way, right? And it's all very kind of conscious and purposeful and deliberate. And so there's intentionality there, but more recent scholarly approaches to thinking about rhetoric kind of abandon intentionality and focus on just like what's happening, what's accomplished, what's impacted. It doesn't really matter how much intentionality is factoring in because certain things are happening no matter what. And so that's what we want to focus on. And so he's kind of getting into that question with regard to animals. To what extent is an animal being deliberate or intentionally artistic, especially? That question of invention. To what extent is an animal inventing their rhetoric, right? He says the end of that first long paragraph, although the existence of second-order intentionality among non-human animals remains controversial, there is evidence that primates have beliefs they wish others to believe, that a leopard is nearby, so on. Or in the case of chimpanzees, understand to some extent each other's goals and motives. So he's opening up some possibility for deliberateness in the animal kingdom in terms of invention, in terms of rhetorical artistry. Maybe not full scale like us humans, but there's some, you can point to some examples of it. Now again, what is the point of that? In terms of just understanding what animals do, it's kind of fascinating, but in terms of like how it matters for us, the connections are a little thinner here. So with that, we'll just quickly jump into the Keith Lloyd sort of update. Again, this is 2020, and it's an introduction to a volume where different scholars are writing about different kinds of comparative rhetorics. And all I'll maybe mention here is that, his approach is to say, thank you, George Kennedy, to kind of get the ball rolling, like, 20 years prior or whatever, 22 years prior. Here's the work that's sort of been done since then, and then here's what we want to be thinking about today, right? And again, Lloyd is not interested in animals. He's interested in cultures, and he's interested in world culture. So this is more like intercultural world global rhetorics or something like that. So he's going through and covering some of the work that's been done. There's, he says like there's been some and it's been good, but we want to do more. Hence the book, right? Hence the volume. And the real focus of Lloyd and his contributors is on a kind of dissatisfaction with basically what we're learning in this class, right? Up until this point, we've been, again, referring back to these four main models. Now, I'm not one who says there is a rhetoric and it's Aristotle's or it's Cicero's or whatever. We have these four major kind of traditions in the West, but we can obviously think about more. I haven't yet come up against a fifth or a sixth model that to me looks like a self-contained, robust, singularly kind of compelling thing, but hey, blow me away, right? So the main focus here again is like, let's go beyond Rome, Greece, let's go beyond Greece, let's go beyond Athens, let's go beyond the West itself, and let's think about rhetoric in all over, wherever we might find it. And again, maybe these other cultures are using the word rhetoric or words like rhetoric, or maybe they're not using the word rhetoric at all, but there it is kind of thing. I remember when I was in grad school working with Tom Conley, that he had another student, Todd Sandell, who I think married Chinese, had a Chinese wife maybe, and he was really interested in Chinese rhetoric. So there was already, there's some of this kind of stuff happening, and good on it, right? It's like, what are the similarities and distinctions? What is familiar? What is fresh? It's hard to kind of study everything, but by all means, let's learn more. So at the bottom of that second page, page 3, it says, while editing this book, I sought to resist forces within the field, edging emergent scholars toward the normalized discourse of Greco-Roman rhetoric. So basically, like, younger scholars in the field need to realize that there is not just these kind of singular, like, it's all Aristotle or it's all Cicero. Like, I think we've well moved past that. As good as those models are, we want to be open. We want to be thinking about otherness, other possibilities. All right, so the last sort of bits of this intro piece is to talk about the rhetoric in comparative rhetoric and then the comparative in comparative rhetoric. And the rhetoric that Keith Lloyd's talking about here, his particular kind of approach, is pretty good. I like it. I've never heard of this before. But in the middle of that page on 4, it says, this looseness in terms of, this is the bigness of rhetoric, the capaciousness of rhetoric. He says it's an open door for us to kind of plant our flag and say what we think rhetoric is. So he says, although traditional Aristotelian rhetoric defines rhetoric as an art of persuasion, in considering a more overarching view, I return to my introductory writing course definition. Rhetoric is the shaping of what and how. I've never heard that before, but I like it. I actually use the word shaping quite a bit in my own work, this materialist work. You can think of shaping almost like a sculpture, like clay, like very physical, right? But you can also shape ideas and shape attitudes and so on. So I think it works pretty well. So we want a definition of rhetoric that's broad enough to kind of encompass all these different global comparative approaches, but that's not confining, right? And that's really the kind of the trick of this approach to rhetoric, is to find that balance, or those points of contact between the infinite and the local, or the general and the particular, or the here and the there, recognizing what can't be the same, and also recognizing what is close to the same, or pretty close, or maybe even identical, right? I think that's important. So shaping this, and then the next page over on 5, there's the second full paragraph is good. So even if we're looking at, comparing this culture to that culture, once we start doing that, we get into this business of, like, if we say to ourselves, okay, even though in the West, in terms of our own history, like Greece, Athens, democracy, all this stuff is kind of like where we see our origin story, it's important to kind of think more broadly about others and how they use and engage in rhetoric and rhetorical practice. But once we start doing that, and once we start saying, once we start taking seriously other cultures and practices, then we need to start to back away from something like cultural egoism, or this notion that the way we do it is better. And so now we have this challenge of trying to better understand, ours in relation to others. These practices over here in relation to those practices over there. But if we can't assume that one's better or worse than the other, then how do we deal with this business of standards or truth, or, So that's kind of what we're getting into in this paragraph, the issue of truth. Some say the new normal is a post-truth reality, but I find that phrase ridiculous. We need to employ the what and the how to resist ridiculous and hateful analogies. We need to shape the difference between political correctness and correctness. We need to pick our fights. These truths remain. Here, I like this. Each of us lives for only a brief time. We thrive given the opportunity to freely make choices. We get the most good done for all if we work together, and all human beings deserve respect. Notice how these are value statements, right? If we attach ourselves or our work to certain kind of grounded, defensible values, then I think we can do this job of like comparing, right? It's like, does it promote, positive human interaction? Does it promote tolerance and understanding? Now, these are Western values, and to a certain extent, we can't get out of our preference for them, but it's hard to disagree with these as values, right? So at the end of that paragraph, rhetorical studies and comparative rhetoric need to move center stage in a world drifting closer and closer to total absurdity. So this is needed right now because of all of our... Globally speaking, countries are going in the kind of inward direction, right? Building walls and fences and get out. So we need better cultural rhetorics and more sensitive, but also not just like, we hate ourselves, the way you do it's better. It's about defending what we like about what we do, understanding better what others are doing, and seeing if we can build bridges and share and swap and help each other. Wouldn't that be nice? So that's the comparison rhetoric, right? Moving beyond the Greco-Roman tradition, thinking about all different kinds of cultures and nations and practices, perspectives, identities, and I need to wrap up. So comparative rhetoric's revisited. Section 5 there is the last kind of important one that I would urge you to look at. But that's about it, gang. So comparative rhetorics is, again, an attempt to chase rhetoric wherever it might go, might need to go, even if that means into the animal kingdom, or even if that means like, parts of the planet where we haven't, thought about rhetoric before. But is it there? Is it there explicitly, or is it there implicitly? How does it work? Does it work effectively? So on and so on. So there you go. I will stop there, and we will continue on next week with further discussions about rhetoric. Hope you're all well. Peace.